Ethiopia's currency has fallen 30% today as the Ethiopian government allowed their currency, the birr, to float on the international markets for the first time in decades. But this really wasn't Ethiopia's decision. Their hand was forced by the IMF, World Bank, and other groups who have offered the African nation $10 billion in a combined loan package if they dropped protectionist policies for their currency. The IMF is certainly excited, with their managing director stating that this is a landmark movement for Ethiopia. So let's talk about what is meant by a float, why is Ethiopia making this change, why Western organizations, including the IMF and World Bank, allocated over $10 billion to get Ethiopia to float the birr, and what ties the financial decision makers in Ethiopia have to the West. A currency float simply means that a currency can be exchanged on foreign markets. For the past few decades, the Ethiopian Central Bank has been opposed to allowing the birr to be floated. The previous two governors were in favor of policies that isolated the currency from speculators and foreign entities. For the past few decades, Ethiopia was fairly successful in this regard, at least on paper. But this policy also caused currency shortages, led to black markets springing up for foreign currencies, and the central bank often found themselves restricted by the mandate to maintain the exchange rate above all else. The reality is that this monetary policy did make it more challenging for international businesses to make investments in Ethiopia. The World Bank and the IMF did not like this, nor did certain business interests, and they believed that if Ethiopia would drop this protectionist policy, that they would see GDP growth and thus a greater ability to pay their debts. Yet they could never convince the previous administrations to float the birr. Fortunately for them, the current Ethiopian government has deep Western ties. The current head of the central bank was previously a senior operations officer at the World Bank. The finance minister was a member of the World Bank Group's Advisory Council on Gender and Development. The president spent much of her career working for the UN. While this doesn't necessarily mean that they are controlled by the West, it certainly does lend itself to a pro-Western bias. Using these deep ties, the World Bank and IMF were finally able to push Ethiopia to open their currency up to the world markets. They were close to cutting a similar deal with Ethiopia in 2019 until a conflict derailed the plan. So in 2024, the West came with an offer they couldn't refuse, over $10.5 billion in loans, $3.5 billion from the IMF, $3.5 billion from the World Bank, and a mix of loans from different sources. All they needed to access this money was to float the birr, which they did. So what happened? As soon as the birr hit the open market, just as critics warned, the birr dropped 30% against the US dollar, which is a bad first impression. Supporters of this move would argue that 1, this more or less reflected the actual exchange rate, which would have been there anyway for people exchanging on the black market, and 2, the market is fickle and that the birr could recover just as easily as it went into this trouble. These are fairly reasonable points. However, my concern is whether this increased debt load will force the central bank to inflate the currency further. And why is that? Ethiopia's government revenue was $6.43 billion in 2022, while the external debt servicing costs were $3 billion per year, on $28 billion in total obligations. Adding $10 billion to this amount may help short-term cash flow issues, but the cost of servicing this debt could easily consume over 70% of the government revenue in the near future, which would force the central bank to print more money to maintain economic solvency, which would lower the value of the birr, which would make the debt almost impossible to pay without borrowing more money from the IMF and World Bank, and this is what we would call a debt spiral. So can Ethiopia avoid a negative outcome with these changes? I believe that they can. If the central bank can avoid expanding the money supply to make up for budgetary gaps, they should be able to prevent inflation. If they protect their manufacturing base, they should be able to create many more value-added jobs, and if they embrace intra-African trade without resorting to increased export of their raw resources, they should have the assets necessary to grow the economy. But I want to know what you guys think. Should Ethiopia have floated their currency in order to integrate into the global financial marketplace? Was injecting this additional capital from the IMF and the World Bank the right move? And am I covering this situation fairly, or do you think I overlooked another angle? Let me know in the comments below. And as always, if this video provided value to you, give me a like and a follow. That really helps out my channel, and I'll see you guys on the next video.